The radio crackled with static over the Hindu Kush Mountains, where the snow met stone in jagged ridges that had swallowed empires whole. Forward operating base Ripcord was dying, and everyone knew it. 12 hours of sustained assault had reduced the perimeter to rubble and prayer. The Taliban had artillery now, real artillery, not the improvised rockets they'd grown accustomed to dismissing. 3 bunkers had collapsed. The medevac birds wouldn't fly. Command had made the calculation that haunts every war. Some assets are too valuable to risk for those already written off. Captain Marcus Dalton stood in the operations center, staring at a map that no longer matched reality and keyed his radio with hands that had forgotten how to stop shaking. He gave the order nobody wanted to hear, the one that would follow him forever. Pull back to the secondary ridge. Abandon the wounded who couldn't walk. Save who you can. His voice cracked on the last word. 40 miles south, Captain Rivika Torch Olensky was already airborne when the transmission came through. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II groaned through turbulence like an angry god refusing to sleep. The jet was older than her military career, panels mismatched from a dozen different airframes, hydraulic fluid weeping from seams that had been patched and repatched until the mechanics stopped counting. They called it the Warthog for good reason. Ugly, mean, built to take punishment that would drop anything sleeker from the sky. She'd flown this particular bird for 3 years, knew every shudder and complaint, trusted it more than she trusted most people. The mission brief had been simple: close air support for a convoy 20 miles east. Routine. The kind of sortie where you fire a burst to scatter an ambush, maybe drop a single bomb on a confirmed position, then head home for powdered eggs and weak coffee. But Rivika had learned to listen to silence. When the radio went quiet during active operations, it meant someone was making a choice they couldn't say aloud. She'd been that someone before, back when she flew medevac choppers in her first deployment, before the incident that got her grounded and reassigned. Before they stuck her in the jet nobody else wanted to fly, doing missions nobody else wanted to claim. Her weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Cade Prout, sat behind her running diagnostics on the targeting pod. He was new, still believed in the mission briefs, still thought wars had clean edges. She almost envied that. Then command broke silence, and everything changed. All call signs. Ripcord is compromised. Immediate emergency extraction authorized. Proceed to. The transmission dissolved into static and gunfire. Rivika's hands were already moving, banking hard north before her conscious mind caught up. Cade's protest died in his throat when he saw her face in the mirror. She'd gone somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't follow. The throttle pushed forward. The Warthog screamed toward mountains that were already killing better men than her. But Rivika Olensky had learned something in the years since they'd taken her wings and given them back broken. Redemption doesn't wait for permission. The tactical frequency exploded with overlapping voices, soldiers screaming coordinates and casualty counts in the compressed language of people who'd stopped expecting to survive. Ripcord's perimeter had collapsed from 3 sides. Taliban fighters were inside the wire now, moving through the trenches with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. The Americans were consolidating around the aid station, a bunker that had never been designed to hold this many bodies. Captain Dalton had made it there with half his command element, leaving blood in the snow behind them. His radio man was dead. His second lieutenant had taken shrapnel through both legs and was still trying to organize the defense, tourniquet tight enough to stop the bleeding but not tight enough to save the limb. Nobody said it aloud, but they all knew. When the ammunition ran out, it would be knives and hands and then nothing at all. Dalton tried raising command again. The response came from a colonel 300 miles away in an air-conditioned operations center, voice carefully neutral in that way senior officers practice when delivering death sentences. Ripcord, be advised, no air assets available your position. Weather has closed the corridor. Proceed with tactical withdrawal to secondary positions and await. Dalton didn't hear the rest. He looked at the 37 soldiers packed into a space meant for 12, at the 6 wounded who'd be left behind, at the IV bags hanging from ammunition racks because they'd run out of proper stands 2 hours ago. Withdrawal meant abandoning those who couldn't walk. It meant listening to them die on the radio during the retreat. He'd given orders that cost lives before. That's what command means. But this was different. This was choosing who gets to be human. Ravika's voice cut through the frequency like a blade. "Ripcord, this is Torch 2-1. 1 mile out, talk to me." Her call sign was a joke, or it had been once. Back in her helicopter days, they'd called her Torch because she'd crashed a bird so hard it burned for 3 days. The investigation cleared her: mechanical failure, ice in the fuel lines, bad luck, but the name stuck. When she transferred to fixed wing, they kept it, a reminder of failure wrapped in casual cruelty. She'd learned to wear it without flinching. Dalton grabbed the handset like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. "Torch, Ripcord actual. We are combat ineffective, critically low ammunition. 6 urgent surgical, weather is Christ, you can't be serious. They told us nothing was flying." "Ripcord Torch, repeat your coordinates and enemy positions. I've got 30mm and enough hate to redecorate this valley." Her voice was steady, almost gentle, the way you talk to someone standing on a ledge. Behind her, Cade was pulling up the targeting feeds, fingers flying across the panel. He'd heard the stories about Torch, everyone had. The pilot who broke a helicopter, who got people killed, who only flew the A-10 because nothing else would take her. But the woman on the radio didn't sound broken. She sounded like physics, inevitable and exact. Dalton rattled off coordinates from memory, his map long since abandoned. The Taliban had mortars on the North Ridge, machine gun nests in the eastern rocks, infantry pushing through the southern approaches. It was a textbook encirclement, the kind you study in war college right before the instructor explains why everyone in the scenario dies. He gave her the numbers clinically, ashamed at how relieved he felt to pass the burden to someone else, even if that someone was just another corpse waiting to happen. Ravika listened, eyes scanning the mountain terrain through her HUD as she processed the tactical picture. It was bad. Worse than bad. It was the kind of situation where air power alone doesn't matter because there's no room for error, no time for a second pass. The weather had closed in behind her, thick clouds scraping the peaks, visibility dropping toward zero. In 30 minutes, maybe less, this valley would be completely socked in. If she went down here, nobody was coming. The Warthog could take damage, but it couldn't fly through solid granite. She ran the calculations automatically: fuel state, weapons loadout, time on station versus time to egress before the weather killed her. The math said turn around. The math said let Dalton make his terrible choice and live with it because that's war. That's always been war. She armed her gun anyway. "Ripcord, torches in hot. Keep your heads down and don't shoot at the ugly plane." She rolled the A-10 into a dive, the familiar G-force pressing her into the seat. This was the part civilians never understood about the Warthog. It wasn't fast, wasn't agile, looked like something built from spare parts in a junkyard. But when you needed something dead, and you needed it dead right now, when you needed a flying gun platform that could absorb ground fire and keep flying, there was nothing else like it. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon built into the nose fired 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second. It made a sound like the universe tearing, a metallic roar that announced itself before the rounds arrived. She'd fired it hundreds of times in training, dozens in combat. It never stopped being exactly what it sounded like: God's own chainsaw, carving reality into new configurations. The North Ridge appeared through a break in the clouds, and she saw them, 3 mortar positions, Taliban fighters scrambling as they realized what was diving toward them. Ravika adjusted her angle by instinct and muscle memory, the targeting reticle sliding across her vision. Cade was calling out ranges, wind corrections, but she was already firing. The gun shook the entire airframe, a violent rattling that felt like flying through thunder. The ridge exploded in geysers of stone and fire. Bodies? She didn't let herself think bodies, just targets, just problems requiring solutions, vanished into red mist. The mortars disintegrated, twisted metal and shattered wood spinning into the valley below. She pulled up hard, feeling every rivet strain, and banked for the eastern approach. Ripcord torch. North ridge is clear. Coming around for the machine gun nests. Mark your friendlies. Her breathing was controlled, mechanical. This was the space where Rivika lived now, where thought and action collapsed into a single fluid motion. No hesitation, no doubt, just the work. Below her, she could see Ripcord's perimeter, could see the desperate cluster of soldiers around the aid station. She could see the bodies in the snow, American and Taliban both, could see the tracers arcing up from multiple positions. If she'd been a different person with a different history, she might have felt fear. Instead, she felt something colder and more useful, focus sharpened to a cutting edge. Dalton was shouting grid coordinates, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. The machine gun nests were dug into the rocks, hardened positions that would take direct hits to eliminate. Rivika came in low, too low, the kind of altitude where a lucky rifle shot could punch through the cockpit. The A-10's armor was legendary, titanium bathtubs surrounding the pilot, redundant systems, designed to fly home with half the aircraft shot away. She'd need all of it. The eastern rocks lit up with muzzle flashes as they opened fire, green tracers streaming toward her like luminescent rain. Rounds sparked off the fuselage, punched through the wings. Cade flinched. Rivika didn't. She squeezed the trigger and walked her fire across the rocks, the cannon's roar drowning out everything else, including the screaming damage alarms. Stone vaporized. Machine guns ceased to exist. When she pulled up this time, the right engine was coughing black smoke, and two hydraulic systems were showing red. "Torch, you're hit. Disengage," Command's voice, finally catching up to what was happening, trying to impose order on chaos that had stopped caring about regulations. Rivika ignored them. The southern approach was still pouring fighters toward Ripcord, and her warthog still had teeth. She came around again, fighting sluggish controls, the bird struggling to stay airborne with one engine dying and damage she couldn't see spreading through the hydraulic lines. Cade was reading her the damage reports, voice rising in pitch, but she was somewhere beyond hearing now. The Southern infantry had scattered when they saw the North Ridge disappear, but they were professionals, Taliban veterans who'd learned not to run in straight lines or cluster together. They'd spread out among the boulders and ravines, making targeting difficult, using the terrain the way their fathers and grandfathers had used it against the Soviets and the British before them. Smart tactics, good training. It wouldn't matter. Rivika dropped lower, the warthog now flying through small arms fire so thick it looked like rain. Her left wing took a burst that punched straight through, daylight visible through the holes. The aircraft shuddered, wanted to roll, but she forced it level through pure muscle and spite. The gun spoke again, shorter bursts now, conserving ammunition, each one precisely aimed. Taliban fighters vanished into the earth, not even time to scream. She was surgical, economical, every round accounting for itself in blood and silence. When she pulled up this time, the southern approach was quiet except for the wind. Ripcord's perimeter wasn't collapsing anymore. The shooting had stopped. Dalton stood in the ruins of the aid station, staring at skis that had just rewritten the definition of salvation. The soldiers around him were crying, some of them, the ones still capable of emotion after 12 hours of mechanized slaughter. Others just stared, shock written across their faces in blood and cordite. The 6 wounded who'd been marked for abandonment were still alive, still breathing, still expecting to die in slightly more comfortable circumstances. But they weren't dying today. The Taliban were retreating, pulling back to regroup, and the weather was finally clearing enough for the medevac birds to risk the flight. Dalton keyed his radio with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, trying to find words that could possibly be adequate. "Torch, Ripcord, I don't. We owe you everything. We owe you our lives." Rivika's response came through broken by static and the grinding sound of a dying engine. "Ripcord torch, just doing the job. Get your people out. I need to find somewhere to put this bird down before it decides for me." Her voice was calm, almost casual, betraying nothing of the fact that her aircraft was disintegrating around her. The right engine had seized completely now. The left was running at 60% and dropping. She'd lost most of her hydraulic pressure, was flying on backups that weren't designed to handle this kind of damage. The flight controls felt like stirring concrete. Every input took twice the force, and the A-10 responded with a delay that kept lengthening. She was 10 miles from ripcord, 15 miles from the nearest friendly runway, and every instinct trained into her over 15 years of military aviation was screaming that she wasn't going to make it. Behind her, Cade had stopped reading damage reports. There were too many, and they both knew what they meant. "Torch, we need to eject, right now. This bird's done." He was right by every regulation and safety protocol ever written. The ejection seats would get them clear, and maybe they'd survive the landing. Maybe the rescue teams would find them before the Taliban did. Maybe. Ravika checked her altitude, her heading, her fuel state. She was over inhabited valleys now, villages clustered along the valley floor, farmers and families who'd spent 20 years learning to ignore the sound of distant gunfire. If she ejected, the A-10 would fly itself into the ground somewhere below, thousands of pounds of metal and unexpended ammunition and burning fuel. It would hit something, a house, a field, a school. It would kill people who'd already given enough to this war. Negative, Cade, we're riding her down. She banked toward a stretch of relatively flat ground she'd spotted on the approach, what looked like a dried riverbed flanked by rocks that would tear the aircraft apart if she misjudged by 10 feet in either direction. It wasn't a runway. It wasn't even an airstrip. It was a scar in the earth that might be long enough and smooth enough to not kill them instantly. Cade started to argue, then stopped. He'd known her for 3 months, flown a dozen missions, and in that moment he understood what everyone else had taken years to learn. Torch didn't eject. Not from helicopters that could still auto-rotate, not from jets that could still glide. She'd already left people behind once years ago when she'd walked away from a burning crash while her crew chief died in the flames. The investigation cleared her. She'd been unconscious, concussed, had done everything right. But that didn't matter. The dead don't care about investigations. The riverbed was rushing up at them, rocks and sand and the edge of disaster. Ravika cut the power to the dying left engine, didn't want asymmetric thrust spinning them into the ground. She was gliding now, a 30,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a refrigerator, dropping toward Earth at a rate that made her teeth ache. Cade, brace, this is going to be rough. She'd made dozens of emergency landings in her career, but always with at least partial power, always with hydraulics that responded. This was different. This was physics and prayer and the slowly crystallizing certainty that she'd made a mistake, that she should have ejected when she had the chance, that pride was going to kill them both. The ground was 30 seconds away. 20. 10. The A-10 hit the riverbed at 140 knots, too fast, the impact slamming through the titanium bathtub and into her spine. The nose gear collapsed immediately, and the bird pitched forward, gouging into sand and gravel, throwing up a wall of debris that whited out the canopy. Metal screamed. Something exploded, not the fuel tanks, not yet, just hydraulic lines rupturing under pressure they were never meant to handle. The right wing caught a boulder and sheared off, spinning into the rocks with a sound like artillery. They were sliding sideways now, still moving, still dying. Ravika fought the controls even though they were useless, even though the aircraft was already deciding its own fate. The left wing clipped something, and they spun, a lazy rotation that seemed to take hours, the landscape outside the canopy blurring into abstract streaks of brown and gray. Then they stopped. Just stopped, like someone had remembered to press pause. Ravika sat in the sudden silence, listening to metal tick as it cooled, to the crackle of small fires starting in places she couldn't see. Her hands were still gripping the stick, knuckles white, muscle memory refusing to let go. Behind her, Cade was gasping, hyperventilating through the crash-landing adrenaline dump. She ran through the emergency shutdown procedures automatically. Kill the remaining power, secure the weapon systems, prepare to evacuate. Her body was moving before her mind caught up. They needed to get clear before the fuel tanks decided to ignite properly, before the unexpended ammunition started cooking off. She popped the canopy, and cold mountain air flooded in, carrying the smell of burning hydraulic fluid and scorched metal. Cade out. Now. They scrambled from the wreckage, sliding down the damaged fuselage and half running, half stumbling away from the bird that had just saved 37 lives and nearly killed them both. Ravika made it 50 yards before her legs remembered they were allowed to stop working, and she collapsed into the sand, breathing hard, staring back at her warthog. The looked like it had been through a war, which it had. Both wings damaged beyond repair, nose gear gone, fuselage peppered with bullet holes, one engine completely missing. But it had flown. Even broken, even dying, it had flown long enough. She felt something crack in her chest, something that had been frozen since the day she walked away from burning wreckage while someone else didn't. It felt like grief. It felt like absolution. It felt like both. The rescue helicopters found them 90 minutes later, guided in by Cade's emergency beacon and the smoke from the Warthog's small fires. The pilots circled twice, like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. An A-10 that should have fallen from the sky an hour ago, somehow brought down in one piece in a riverbed that couldn't possibly have been long enough. The flight medic who checked Ravika for injuries kept asking how they were alive, and she didn't have an answer that would make sense. She'd flown beyond the aircraft's limits, beyond her own limits, into territory where skill stopped mattering and only will remained. The Warthog had done the rest, that ugly, indestructible, beautiful bird that refused to die when dying was the logical thing to do. They loaded her into the helicopter, and she watched the A-10 disappear below, still sitting in that riverbed like a monument to something she couldn't quite name. Back at base, the story was already spreading through the radio networks and operations centers. Someone at Ripcord had recorded portions of the radio traffic, and now it was playing on loop in ready rooms from Bagram to Baghdad. People were talking about the pilot who'd ignored orders, who'd flown through weather that grounded every other aircraft, who'd saved a fob that command had already written off. They were using her call sign differently now, not as mockery but as something approaching reverence. Torch, the pilot who burned through regulations and impossible odds and fear itself. She hated it and needed it in equal measure. The debriefing lasted 6 hours, conducted by officers who couldn't decide whether to court-martial her or recommend her for a medal. She'd violated standing orders, exceeded her mission parameters, risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft on an unauthorized rescue. But she'd also saved 37 American lives and prevented Ripcord from becoming another entry in the long list of tactical disasters that haunt military historians. Captain Dalton testified via radio link from Bagram, where he was overseeing the evacuation of his wounded soldiers. He spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't end anyone's career, but the gratitude underneath was impossible to miss. The 6 men who'd expected to die in that aid station were alive. That had to count for something. The Board of Inquiry adjourned without conclusions, kicking the decision upstairs to people with more stars and better lawyers. Ravika didn't wait for their verdict. She filed the after-action report with the clinical precision of someone who'd done it too many times, then walked out to the flight line where the aircraft waited. Not her Warthog. That bird was still in the Hindu Kush, probably being stripped for parts by now or left to rust in that riverbed, as a warning to other pilots about the costs of heroism. But there were others, a line of A-10s in various states of disrepair, each one ugly and mean and built to bring people home. She ran her hand along the nose of the nearest bird, feeling the rivets and patches, the history written in scars and repairs. Somewhere behind her, she heard footsteps and turned to find Cade approaching with 2 coffees and an expression that suggested he had questions he wasn't ready to ask. "They're going to clear you," he said, handing her a cup that was mostly creamer and optimism. "Dalton's testimony sealed it. You'll probably get a reprimand for the rules violations, but nothing that sticks." He paused, studying her face, trying to read the calculation happening behind her eyes. "Everyone's calling you a hero now. How's that feel?" It was a genuine question, not sarcasm. He'd been there, had felt the airframe shaking apart around them, had made peace with dying in a riverbed whose name they'd never know. He'd also heard the stories about her past, the whispers that followed her through ready rooms and briefings. He was trying to square those versions, and it wasn't working. Ravika sipped the coffee, which was terrible and perfect. Heroes don't exist, Cade. Just people who made a choice and got lucky enough to survive it. She stared at the warthog, seeing instead the helicopter from 8 years ago, the one that had fallen from the sky and taken Chief Warrant Officer James Remick with it. She'd been 26 then, a promising young pilot with a clean record and a future that looked bright. The crash had changed that, not because of what happened but because of what she couldn't remember. The investigation found mechanical failure, ice in the fuel lines, like she'd told command, like the maintenance logs confirmed. But there were gaps in her memory, seconds or minutes lost to concussion, and in those gaps lived the question she'd never been able to answer. Had she missed something? Some warning, some indicator that would have given Remick time to bail out before the bird hit the ground and burned. The Army cleared her. Her squadron commander fought to keep her flying. But the doubt lived in spaces that facts couldn't reach, and eventually she'd requested the transfer to fixed-wing, to aircraft where she flew alone or with a WSO who could eject independently, where if she failed, she'd be the only casualty. They'd given her the A-10, the jet nobody wanted, the close air support mission that had been declared obsolete every year for 3 decades, the plane that flew low and slow and took ground fire because that was the job. She'd flown it well enough to stay current, competently enough to avoid scrutiny, but never with the passion that had once defined her career. Until today. Until ripcord, until 37 lives had hung on a decision she didn't have time to overthink. "You saved us," Cade said quietly. "Not just ripcord me. When we were going down, you could have punched out. Regulations said you should have, but you didn't because you saw that village below, saw what would happen if the bird hit uncontrolled. You brought us down manually and it nearly killed us both. That's not luck, Captain, that's something else." He was right, but he was also missing the point. She hadn't stayed with the aircraft out of nobility or selflessness. She'd stayed because the alternative, walking away from another crash, leaving another person behind, even if it was by the book and justified, would have destroyed whatever pieces of herself she'd managed to preserve. The dead don't care about regulations, but the living have to find ways to look in mirrors. Before she could respond, a staff car pulled up, and a colonel she didn't recognize stepped out, carrying a folder that looked suspiciously official. Behind him came Captain Dalton, fresh from Bagram, arm in a sling and face haggard with exhaustion. The colonel approached with the carefully neutral expression senior officers use when they're about to ruin your day or make your career, and it's impossible to tell which. "Captain Olensky, walk with me." It wasn't a request. Ravika exchanged glances with Cade, who suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, and fell into step beside the colonel as he led her away from the flight line, toward the operations building, and whatever judgment waited inside. The office they entered was sparse: desk, chairs, a map on the wall showing territory that would look different next month and entirely different in a year. The colonel gestured for her to sit, then spent a long moment arranging papers he didn't need to arrange. Dalton stood by the door, watching the exchange with the intensity of someone who'd spent the last 18 hours fighting to ensure this conversation happened at all. Finally, the colonel spoke, and his voice carried the weight of someone delivering news he'd rehearsed but didn't quite believe. "Captain Olensky, the Board of Inquiry has completed its review. Your actions at Forward Operating Base Ripcord were irregular. You violated standing orders regarding weather minimums, exceeded your mission parameters without authorization, and engaged targets outside your assigned area of operations. By regulation, that should result in administrative action at minimum." Ravika kept her expression neutral, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The colonel continued, a ghost of a smile appearing. "However, your actions also directly resulted in the preservation of 37 American lives and prevented the loss of a strategically significant position. Captain Dalton's testimony, supported by radio intercepts and damage assessments, indicates that ripcord would have been overrun without your intervention. The wounded who were triaged for evacuation would not have survived. The tactical situation was unrecoverable. He paused, studying her face. Command has decided that the irregular nature of your actions is outweighed by the results. No administrative action will be taken. Furthermore, you're being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The paperwork is already moving through channels. The words landed without impact, sliding past whatever part of her brain was supposed to process recognition and achievement. A medal. They were giving her a medal for doing what should have been done, for not abandoning people when abandoning them was the efficient choice. Ravika nodded once, acknowledging the information without embracing it. "Thank you, sir. Is that all?" The colonel looked momentarily taken aback, like he'd expected a different reaction. Gratitude maybe, or relief, or the kind of emotional display that makes commanders uncomfortable. Instead, he was facing a woman who'd just been told she wouldn't be punished for saving lives, and she was taking it with the enthusiasm of someone receiving a weather briefing. Dalton stepped forward, his good hand clenched into a fist. "That's not all, Colonel, if I may." He turned to Ravika, and his voice carried an edge she hadn't heard on the radio, anger mixed with something rower. "I gave the order to abandon 6 men, Captain. 6 soldiers under my command who'd fought for 12 hours straight, who'd held that position because I told them it mattered. And I was going to leave them to die because some colonel 300 miles away said the math didn't work, that the risk to rescue assets outweighed the value of their lives. I was going to make that call and carry it forever." His voice cracked just slightly. "You didn't let me. You ignored orders, flew through weather that should have killed you, and took damage that should have brought you down. You saved those 6 men. You saved all of us." So when the colonel says, "no administrative action," what he means is command doesn't know how to process someone who still believes the math is wrong. The silence that followed was heavy with things nobody had clearance to say aloud. The colonel cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the direction this had taken. "Captain Dalton, I understand the emotions involved, but—" Dalton cut him off, which was technically insubordination, but nobody was going to call it that today. "With respect, sir, you don't understand. You weren't there. You didn't hear your own voice giving the order to pull back, knowing what it meant. You didn't watch Captain Olenski's A-10 diving through ground fire like it was personally offended by the idea of American casualties. The Taliban had won that fight, and she took the win away from them round by round. If that's not worthy of recognition beyond a medal that'll sit in a drawer somewhere, then we're doing this wrong." Ravika stood, the movement cutting through the tension with physical finality. "Captain Dalton, I appreciate the testimony. Colonel, I accept the board's findings. If there's nothing else, I have maintenance reports to file." She moved toward the door, but Dalton blocked her path, not aggressively but with the stubborn determination of someone who'd spent too many hours staring at casualty lists. "Torch, Captain, I need you to understand. Those 6 men are alive because of you. Corporal Martinez, who lost both legs but who's going to make it home to meet his daughter. Staff Sergeant Williams, who took shrapnel through his chest and flatlined twice but who's stable now. Private First Class." His voice finally broke completely and he stopped, collecting himself. "They have names, they have families, they have futures that didn't exist 12 hours ago. That's not nothing." She met his eyes, and for a moment the careful walls she'd built after the helicopter crash threatened to crack completely. But walls exist for reasons, and she'd spent 8 years learning to reinforce them. They're alive because the Warthog is built to take punishment and keep flying, because the Taliban didn't get lucky with their targeting, because weather cleared just enough at the right moment. I was there, Captain. That's the job. Don't make it more than that." She stepped around him and left, walking out into the Afghan afternoon where the sun sat low, and the mountains looked like broken teeth against the sky. Behind her, she heard the colonel saying something to Dalton about emotional regulation and appropriate professional boundaries, but it faded into the background noise of a war that had been going on longer than some of the soldiers fighting it had been alive. The next 3 weeks passed in the compressed, surreal fashion of military time after significant events. Ravika flew her assigned missions, close air support for convoys, reconnaissance along the Pakistan border, the routine grinding work of a war that had stopped making headlines but continued consuming resources and lives with bureaucratic efficiency. The story of Ripcord had spread, becoming the kind of legend that gets embellished with each retelling, until the facts are buried under layers of mythology. She'd heard versions where she'd single-handedly destroyed an entire Taliban battalion, versions where she'd landed at Ripcord to personally evacuate the wounded, versions where she'd been shot down and walked back to base carrying her weapons systems officer. None of them were true, but truth was less important than narrative in spaces where people needed to believe heroism still existed. The medal ceremony happened on a Thursday, conducted on the tarmac with appropriate military pageantry. The colonel pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to her dress uniform, while photographers documented the moment for official records and public affairs releases. Fellow pilots applauded, their respect genuine if complicated. She'd done what they would have wanted to do, what they liked to think they would have done, but she'd also violated standing orders to do it, which created uncomfortable questions about when disobedience becomes duty. Cade stood in the front row, his own air medal gleaming on his chest, recognition for being there when history happened. He caught her eye during the speeches and offered a small nod that contained multitudes. They'd nearly died together. That created bonds that medals couldn't capture. After the ceremony, Ravika returned to her quarters and placed the medal in her footlocker, next to the other decorations and commendations that tracked 15 years of service. It sat there beside the Purple Heart from her first deployment, the Air Medal with Valor device from the helicopter crash that killed Remik, the campaign ribbons and unit citations that documented where she'd been and what she'd survived. She stared at the collection for a long moment, trying to feel something proportional to their weight, then closed the footlocker and returned to the work of preparing for the next mission. Outside her window, the sun set over Bagram Airfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire seen from a safe distance. Somewhere in those mountains, forward operating base Ripcord was being reinforced, supplied, transformed from a place where men nearly died into a place where men would continue nearly dying until strategy or politics dictated otherwise. Her phone rang, an actual phone call, rare enough in theater to be noteworthy. She answered to find Captain Dalton on the other end, his voice tired but carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during the inquiry. "Torch, I wanted to catch you before I rotate home. Heading back to Fort Campbell tomorrow, going to spend 6 months learning to walk on a prosthetic and remembering how to sleep without checking perimeters." He laughed, a sound that carried damage you couldn't see on X-rays. "I also wanted to say, the board was wrong. It wasn't luck or weather or aircraft design. It was you making choices nobody should have to make, refusing to accept that sometimes the math requires bodies. My kids still have a father because you didn't accept it. Martinez's daughter will know her father. Williams will walk his sister down the aisle next spring. Those aren't small things, no matter how much you try to minimize them." Ravika listened to the weight behind his words, the desperate need to assign meaning to trauma so it becomes bearable. She understood it, had felt it herself in the years after Remik died, searching for reasons why she lived and he didn't. But she'd learned that meaning isn't found. It's chosen, built from the wreckage of what actually happened until it resembles something you can carry. "Captain Dalton, Marcus, I'm glad you're going home. I'm glad your soldiers are going home. The rest." She paused, searching for words that would satisfy him without betraying herself. The rest is just what happens when you refuse to accept that someone else makes the calculation about who matters. They clear you for flight, they try to turn it into legend, but at the end, you're just flying the mission until you can't anymore. That's enough. It has to be. They spoke for a few more minutes, exchanging contact information with the vague promises people make about staying in touch, knowing that probably neither would follow through because some connections exist only in the pressure cooker environment of deployment and don't survive translation to the civilian world. When she hung up, Ravika felt the familiar exhaustion that comes after maintaining walls for too long. She lay back on her bunk, staring at ceiling panels that had been stared at by hundreds of other pilots processing their own versions of survival and guilt and the impossible calculus of war. Tomorrow she'd fly again, probably another convoy escort or routine patrol. The Taliban would still be there, the mountains would still be unforgiving, and the A-10 would still be an ugly, beautiful bird that refused to quit. That was the deal. That was always the deal. 2 months later, Revika Olenska's deployment ended, and she rotated back to the United States with a duffel bag of gear and a head full of memories that would take years to properly process. The Air Force offered her a position as an instructor pilot, training the next generation on the Warthog's idiosyncrasies and tactical employment. It was the kind of posting that usually went to senior captains and junior majors with spotless records and the political awareness to navigate the bureaucracy of military education. She accepted, more from inertia than enthusiasm, and found herself at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where the desert sun beat down with impersonal intensity, and the flight line stretched toward horizons that didn't include mountains trying to kill you. Teaching was different from flying combat missions in ways both obvious and subtle. The students were eager, some of them, terrified of looking incompetent in front of an instructor who'd become minor legend in the close air support community. The story of Ripcord had followed her home, expanded beyond recognition. She'd heard versions now where she'd taken fire from surface-to-air missiles, where she'd flown with half the plane shot away, where she'd personally directed artillery while engaging ground targets. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more terrible. She'd flown through bad weather, shot at people who were shooting at Americans, and landed a damaged aircraft without killing anyone. But legends need exaggeration to survive, and she'd stopped correcting the record because it didn't matter what people believed. What mattered was that the students learned to fly the Warthog properly, learned when to push past the limits, and when the limits were there for good reasons, learned that heroism and stupidity look identical until you know how the story ends. Cade had followed her stateside, promoted to captain and assigned to weapons systems officer training at the same base. They developed an easy partnership, the kind that forms between people who have nearly died together, and decided the experience meant they understood something essential about each other. He helped with the weapons employment curriculum, brought a systems-oriented precision to targeting theory that complemented her intuitive, seat-of-the-pants approach to combat flying. They'd brief the missions together, fly the training sorties with students in trail, debrief with the merciless honesty that separates adequate instruction from excellent preparation. The students respected her but feared him more, which amused them both. She was the one who'd flown into impossible situations, but he was the one who'd grade their targeting runs and find every mistake they'd made. On a Saturday 6 months into the instructor position, Revika received an email that made her stare at her computer screen for longer than was probably healthy. It was from Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Remick, James Remick's widow, someone she hadn't spoken to since the memorial service 8 years ago. The message was short, carefully worded, saying she was in Tucson for work and wondered if Revika had time for coffee. No pressure, no obligation, just an offer that somehow carried the weight of every unspoken question that had lived between them since the crash. Revika's finger hovered over the delete button for a long moment, then moved to reply, accepting the meeting before her conscious mind could articulate all the reasons why it was a terrible idea. They met the next day at a cafe off-base, neutral territory, where neither had to wear the uniform or the history. Sarah looked older, which was obvious and still surprising. 8 years had carved lines into her face that hadn't been there at the funeral, grief aging her in ways that transcended simple time. But her eyes were steady when they shook hands, and her voice was warm without the artificial brightness people sometimes use when addressing the uncomfortable. They ordered coffee and made small talk about nothing for exactly as long as politeness required. Then Sarah leaned forward slightly and said the thing Revika had been both dreading and needing to hear. "I'm not here for closure. I had that years ago, or as close as I'm going to get. I'm here because I read about Ripcord, about what you did, and I realized I never properly thanked you for trying to save James. The investigation said mechanical failure, said you did everything right, but I always wondered if you blamed yourself anyway. I wanted you to know that I don't, that his kids don't, that whatever you've been carrying all these years, it's heavier than it needs to be. The words landed with surgical precision, cutting through defenses Rivika had built so thoroughly she'd forgotten they were there. She wanted to deflect, to minimize, to change the subject to something less honest, but Sarah was looking at her with the kind of understanding that comes from living with loss long enough to recognize its shapes in other people. So instead, Rivika told the truth, or a version of it that approached honesty. I don't remember the last 30 seconds before impact. Concussion took it. The investigation cleared me. The maintenance logs showed ice in the fuel lines. Everything pointed to mechanical failure. But those 30 seconds, I've spent 8 years wondering if I missed something in that gap, some warning or indicator that would have given James time to bail, if I could have saved him and just don't remember failing. Her voice was steady, clinical, the way you discuss trauma when you've packed it away so tightly that unpacking it feels dangerous. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Rivika's hand, a gesture that was both maternal and conspiratorial. James knew the risks. He knew helicopters fall from the sky sometimes, that ice happens, that mechanical systems fail despite the best maintenance. He wouldn't want you carrying this. And from what I've heard about Ripcord, you've spent the last 8 years trying to make up for a failure that wasn't yours to own. Maybe, and I say this as someone who loved him deeply, maybe it's time to let him rest and let yourself live. They sat in that cafe for 3 more hours, talking about James and grief, and the impossible task of moving forward while honoring what was lost. When they finally parted, Rivika felt something shift in her chest, not resolution exactly, but a loosening of the grip that guilt had maintained on her decision-making since the crash. Sarah had given her something she hadn't known she needed, permission to stop punishing herself. The next day, Rivika stood in front of her advanced tactics class, 30 pilots in various stages of training, and deviated from the approved lesson plan. Today we're going to talk about the hardest decision you'll ever make in this aircraft, she began, watching them straighten in their seats, notebooks ready for tactical wisdom. We're going to talk about when to disobey orders, when to trust your judgment over command's guidance, and when to accept that sometimes the math says people die and you get to decide whether that's acceptable. The room went silent, the kind of attentive quiet that suggests everyone recognizes they're about to hear something that isn't in the manual. She walked them through Ripcord step by step, the initial transmission, the decision to break from her assigned mission, the weather assessment that said turn back, the targeting runs through ground fire, the landing that nearly killed her and Cade. She didn't glamorize it, didn't downplay the violations or the risk. She presented it as what it was, a calculated decision to prioritize lives over regulations, with consequences that could have ended her career or her life. The question you'll face someday, she continued, watching their faces process the implications, is whether you can live with following orders that result in preventable deaths, or whether you can live with the consequences of refusing those orders. There's no right answer that works every time. Sometimes disobedience is courage. Sometimes it's ego and poor judgment. The difference is usually only clear afterward, when you know how it ends. But here's what I learned at Ripcord. If you're not willing to risk your career for the mission and the people depending on you, then you're in the wrong job. This isn't about glory or medals or becoming a legend. It's about looking at the tactical situation and asking yourself what you can live with when you're 80 years old and the adrenaline is long gone and all that's left is memory. One student, a young first lieutenant with barely 300 hours in the Warthog, raised his hand tentatively. Captain Olensky, what if we get it wrong? What if we disobey orders, take the risk, and people die anyway? It was the question that mattered, the one that every pilot who thought seriously about the job eventually confronted. Rivika considered it for a moment, gathering words that would be honest without being crushing. Then you did what you thought was right with the information you had, and you deal with the consequences like a professional. You don't get guarantees in this business. You get incomplete intelligence, rapidly evolving situations, and aircraft that are held together with determination and good engineering. Some days you win. Some days you lose people you were supposed to save. What you can't do, what will destroy you faster than enemy fire, is refuse to make the call because you're afraid of being wrong. The class ran long that day, students asking questions that hadn't occurred to them before, pushing back on doctrine they'd accepted without examination. Cade sat in the back, ostensibly observing but actually recognizing what was happening. Ravika was finally processing ripcord aloud, turning experience into instruction, converting trauma into something useful that could help others survive their own impossible moments. When the last student left, he approached her with 2 coffees and an expression of mild concern. That was a hell of a lesson. Pretty sure it violates about 6 different regulations about encouraging subordinates to disobey orders. She accepted the coffee with a tired smile. Probably. But if one of these kids ends up in a situation like ripcord and remembers that they have options beyond what command authorizes, it'll be worth the reprimand. They walked out to the flight line together, where the warthogs sat in neat rows, sunlight gleaming off panels that had been patched and repaired so many times it was impossible to tell which parts were original. Ravika approached one of the birds, running her hand along the fuselage, feeling the history written in scars and rivets. These aircraft were older than her military career, had flown in conflicts she'd studied in history classes, had brought countless pilots home despite damage that should have been fatal. They were ugly, obsolete, beloved by everyone who'd ever flown them, and derided by everyone who thought war should be clean and technologically sophisticated. She'd spent 8 years flying them after the helicopter crash, treating the assignment as a kind of penance, a way to continue serving without risking anyone but herself. But standing there in the Arizona sun with coffee going cold in her hands, she finally understood what the warthog had been teaching her all along. Sometimes survival isn't about being sleek or fast or perfect. Sometimes it's about being stubborn enough to keep flying when every system says quit, about refusing to accept that the math requires bodies.